Well, good morning. Today's lecture is on the opening year or so of the Civil War. The title is A War for Limited Ends, from Bull Run, the first battle of Bull Run, to the Battle of Shiloh. A War for Limited Ends is an important title because it asserts that Lincoln's war in the first year was not a war to emancipate the slaves or to abolish slavery. The cause of the war was still slavery, and I'll explain that again in the midst of the lecture. But Lincoln's purpose in the first year and a half of the war was to put the Union back together. In order to understand the military aspects of the Civil War, it's essential that a student or someone who is just interested in this conflict have some basic military vocabulary at hand. For example, a regiment in the Civil War, both sides now, was approximately 1,000 men if it were at full strength. And it would be comprised of 10 companies. So 10 companies, a company was about 100 men, 1,000 men in a regiment. A brigade would have 3 to 5 regiments and so on down the line. I have provided a list of these figures for you, so I want you to be sure to take a look at this, at the list of the Civil War units, and understand their sizes, and then, of course, what they do. You should be familiar with the term artillery, cavalry, etc., etc. All that on that handout. So without any further ado, a war for limited ends. Major Robert Anderson and his brave men at Fort Sumter endured 33 hours of bombardment from the artillery of Beauregard's guns that ringed Charleston Harbor. And then they resigned themselves to the inevitable defeat. The surrender of Fort Sumter galvanized the North. On April 15th, Lincoln called for 75,000 Northern volunteers, militiamen, to put down an insurrection, a revolt that he described, and I quote now, as too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. So the police could not put down this revolt. The response was overwhelming. War meetings in every city and hamlet cheered the flag and vowed vengeance on the traitors. There were far more volunteers than Lincoln could use in the first few weeks of the war. The response in the South was even more resolute and patriotic. Southerners whooped and hollered as they met to discuss war plans, and they vowed to whip the Yankees in a month. Virginia and her favorite son, Robert E. Lee. The battle at Sumter moved Virginia to finally decide and secede from the Union. The South's most populated and most industrial state, Virginia was absolutely essential to the Confederacy if the Confederates were to make good their secession. And Virginia's secession brought an emotional crisis to Colonel Robert E. Lee. For Lee was from a prestigious Revolutionary War family. He was 54 years old in 1861, and he was, by all accounts, a Southern Christian / evangelical Christian gentleman. Lee had spent his entire career in the United States Army. He was second in his class at West Point, where he was hit with absolutely zero demerits. This was unheard of both then and now, except for Robert E. Lee. We've already noted his outstanding record in the Mexican War. General of the Army Winfield Scott considered Lee the best officer in the entire nation. Of course, Scott was his commanding officer in Mexico. And Scott now advised Abraham Lincoln to offer Lee field command of all the Union armies. So if Scott and Lincoln had their way, Robert E. Lee would command all of the Union armies. Scott, who was also a Virginian, had chosen the Union rather than Virginia, and he hoped that Robert E. Lee would do the same. Lee did not approve of slavery. Like the founding fathers, Lee believed that slavery was a moral and political evil. Nevertheless, when Virginia cast her lot with the Confederacy, Lee resigned his army commission and went with his native state. He said, "I must either side with or against my section. I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, Virginia, my home, and my children." Lee's anguish was so great, he said to Scott as he resigned from the army, "Save in defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword." Later, Lee did indeed defend his native state, draw his sword, as he agreed to become the commander of Virginia's armed forces. Lee alone, perhaps, early in the war, foresaw a long war. He wrote, "I foresee that the country will have to pass through a terrible ordeal, a necessary expiation, perhaps, of our national sin." So we see that Robert E. Lee voiced the same convictions about the higher purpose of the war, about God's hand in the conflict, that Abraham Lincoln spoke of 4 years later in his second inaugural address, that the war was a punishment from God for the national sin of slavery. In addition to Virginia now, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee joined the previous 7 seceded states to make the Confederacy. And you can see on the map the 10 states that joined the orange states in secession. The pink states, chief among them Kentucky, might have gone out of the Union, but they were held by Union forces, kept from doing so. And in those border states, the people themselves are divided as to whether or not they favor the North or the South. So Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, they are kept in the Union by this divided sentiment and by Union forces. One of the great questions of the Civil War, and a question that I've already answered on several occasions, but it bears repeating now. Why did these states, the states of the Confederacy, wish to leave the Union? Our finest Civil War historian, James McPherson, by the way, his battle cry of freedom won the Pulitzer Prize. He wrote, "The Upper South, like the Lower, went to war to defend the freedom of white men to own slaves and to take them into the territories of the West as they saw fit, lest these white men be enslaved by black Republicans who threatened to deprive them of these liberties." So the Southerners oftentimes wrote of their liberties or spoke of their liberties, and the primary liberty that they were referring to was the liberty to hold black people in slavery and to take black slaves into the Western territories. Scott's master plan. Again, Winfield Scott is the commanding general of Union forces. Amateurism and confusion characterized the initial grand strategy of the war. The curriculum at West Point, the nation's military academy, slighted strategic studies in favor of engineering and math and army administration. So trial and error played a greater role than theory in shaping Civil War strategy in the early years. Indeed, of what need is there of strategy, the grand conception of a war, when the enemy was to be beaten in a matter of weeks? Both sides thought that. Few leaders envisioned a total war for conquest of the enemy. Rather, they saw a war for reunion and or independence. So this is a crucial point that is reflected in the title of the lecture. The North believed that if the South lost a battle or two, it would come to its senses and come back into the Union. The South was equally sure, perhaps more so, that if they gave the North a bloody nose, the Northerners would lose their stomach for the fight and let the Southerners go. The war then was initially fought for limited goals or ends, and thus required a strategy of limited means. It's not a total war. General Scott devised such a strategy. He's a Virginian, remember now, he deplored a bloody war that would devastate the South and require an army of occupation of the southern states for decades. Much better, he thought, to make life difficult for the South until they should give up. Consequently, Scott proposed to blockade the South, cut off her commerce with foreign nations, bring her to her senses. So for Scott's plan, it would feature then the use of the Union Navy to blockade the southern ports and restrict her commerce, thus her lifeline with the rest of the world. Lincoln saw Scott's wisdom. It was a good idea. And the blockade would last the entire war, and it would indeed eventually bring the South to her knees. It would have a tremendous impact on the South. But the blockade alone was inadequate. Lincoln could not afford to simply sit and wait for Scott's anaconda plan. Anaconda, a great huge snake that crushes its victims. You can't simply wait for that to work. It's going to take years. Northern public opinion demanded an invasion of the South to punish traitors. So Lincoln encouraged an attack at Manassas Junction, which was just across the Potomac River in Virginia. If successful, it might discredit the secessionists and lead to the capture of Richmond. Richmond, the capital of the South now. The southern capital was placed in Richmond, Virginia, and it's about 90 miles from Washington, D.C., about 90 miles between the two capitals, Washington, D.C. in the north, but still in a southern state, Maryland, and then Richmond, of course, in the southern state of Virginia. And if an attack across the river from Washington, D.C., just a few miles now, was successful for the Union, it would discredit the secessionists. It might lead to the capture of Richmond, again, only a few miles away. But such an attack would not destroy the social and economic fabric of the South. A relatively painless fall of the southern capital after a few weeks of war might lead to quick reunion. What if that had happened? What if slavery? Later on, the war very clearly becomes a war for emancipation and abolition. What if the war had ended with a Northern victory? Some historians are so confused by this, and indeed some of them on the Civil War video that you're watching, they have no idea what would have happened. But remember the Republican platform on the expansion of slavery into the territories? What was the goal? No expansion of slavery into the territories. What was the purpose of that? Someday, the Western territories would become free states. Someday, the North then, with the West added, would have enough votes in Congress to pass what? A constitutional amendment ending slavery. So in the initial stages of the war is still about slavery. And if the Union were put back together rather quickly, the Republicans would be in charge, and there would be no extension of slavery into the territories. And slavery then, in Lincoln's own words, would be on the ultimate road of extinction. All that happens and it's a significant all that happens in the movement of the war from this limited war to a total war is that the abolition of slavery moves up dramatically. But as long as the North has its way, slavery is going to be a deadlighter. Remember that, please, when Barbara Fields, who is in many ways a fine historian, but she's confused about this, when she says that before the Emancipation Proclamation, the war was senseless carnage. She could not be more wrong. Southern strategy. Southern strategy was obvious. Defend and endure. That is, realize that the North, in order to be victorious, has to defeat the South, has to take Southern territory. The Confederacy need only last longer than the Northern will to win. There's no need to go on the offensive. The Southerners can fight on the defensive, and it's always better, if you can, to fight on the defensive. It's less expensive in terms of blood and treasure. Parallels of the Southern strategy with General George Washington's strategy during the Revolution are relatively obvious. But two factors impinged on the Southern strategy. First, the Southern states each demanded that the Confederate government defend everywhere. Nobody wanted to be invaded. This resulted then in the Southerners having to disperse their forces throughout the South. This is clearly difficult to do. Some places are vastly more important than others, and yet everything, as far as the Southern states were concerned, had to be defended. So Southerners then initially commit the folly of trying to defend everything, and the old military adage is, he who tries to defend everything defends nothing. And then secondly, there was the temperament of the Southern people. And this is a huge factor. In their arrogance, they literally believed that any Southern soldier was better than any 10 Yankees. The rebels itched to teach the bluebellies a lesson. The Richmond Examiner, a newspaper, declared the idea of waiting for blows instead of inflicting them is altogether unsuited to the genius of our people. And so the South, partly to mollify public opinion, developed what Davis called an offensive-defensive strategy. The South would be willing to take the offensive at certain times, given the opportunity. And that's exactly what the South does. The Battle of First Bull Run. Yeah, there are two battles of Bull Run. Sometimes referred to as the Battle of Manassas Junction. The Bull Run River. Now, I don't expect you to memorize these battle maps, but in order to follow lecture and make some sense of what's going on, it's helpful to have the battle map in front of you, and you can pause the lecture and study that at any time you want. That's one of the positives of an online lecture like this, is you don't have to go through it at any particular speed. You can pause and go away and come back and so forth. And then you can study the map as you see fit. So there are positives to an online lecture like this. Well, the Bull Run River runs through Virginia just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Lincoln now sent General Irvin McDowell across the river with the Union Army to meet, again, General P.G.T. Beauregard's Confederate force. Not the last time we're going to run into Beauregard, even in this lecture. The two armies were evenly matched. McDowell complained to Lincoln at one point, well, my soldiers are all green rookies, they're inexperienced. And Lincoln wisely responded, so are the Confederates. Beauregard now arranged his troops along the tree-choked river. So quite helpfully, the Union troops are in blue and the Confederates are in red, so you can see them better. And Beauregard arranged his troops along the tree-choked river, as I just said, intending to launch an attack on the Union left flank, so the left side of the Union forces. So you got to turn yourself around, and in doing that, you will see that the Union left flank is on the southeastern side of that line. So Beauregard, his red forces on his right side are going to attack the Union left. That's the plan. So you got to understand this terminology. I won't bother to explain it again. However, the roar of the Yankee cannon announced to Beauregard that the Bluecoats had attacked his own left flank before he could attack theirs. The Union forces now push the surprised rebels back. The rebels are retreating. Beauregard poured 2 more brigades into his own left flank to stem the attack, but it had no effect. And so you need to know how many men in a brigade. Are there 25? Or are there 5,000? Yeah, 5,000. He put 10,000 men into his left flank, and it does no good whatsoever. Beauregard's forces now retreated across the Warrenton Turnpike, a road. You can probably find it on the map there. And his left began to collapse as it moved up Henry House Hill. Beauregard himself appeared on the hill to try to rally his forces, but to no avail. As the Southerners retreated over Henry House Hill, they ran into an encouraging sight. Imagine you're running for your life, you're coming over the hill, and you look down on the other side, and what do you see? There, just below the crest of the hill, out of sight of the Yankees, were reinforcements. Thomas Jackson's brigade, another 5,000 men, had come up. And they were all standing there in perfect battle formation, flags waving. Now General Barnard Bee of South Carolina pointed to Jackson's brigade, and he shouted at his retreating men, "There's Jackson, standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." The rebels did. They composed themselves. They were embarrassed. They were ashamed. Here's a chance for redemption. And soon, the rebel lines launched a counterattack. The counterattack broke the Yankee charge. By the time the Yankees had gotten up onto Henry House Hill, their attack had straggled out. It had become disorganized, lost its force, as an attack will do over a considerable distance. And now Jackson and the remnants of the other parts of Beauregard's army launched this counterattack. Some of the Yankee units began to retreat and then others to run. And once other Union soldiers see men running and coming out of the smoke, they naturally panic themselves. Soon the Union army was in full flight, back down the roads, back across the bridges, and back to Washington, D.C. No Union officer could stem the flight of frightened Union soldiers. There was no Thomas Stonewall Jackson there to stop that retreat. And when I say retreat, I'm being kind. They're running. First Bull Run was an unqualified Confederate victory. Southern morale soared, and quite rightly so. And the esprit de corps, the spirit of the soldiers born at Bull Run, would be an important factor in more Southern victories. Men who belonged to Jackson's brigade bragged of it, if they survived the war, for the rest of their lives. Moreover, it would be 8 months again before another Union army would invade Virginia. 8 months, precious time for the South to organize, raise more forces, and so forth. On the other hand, response in the North was not defeatism. Southerners were wrong when they thought the North, after getting a bloody nose, would simply give up the fight. No, the response in the North is determination. Lincoln ordered creation of a new professional army, the Army of the Potomac. And he placed George McClellan in command of the army. And McClellan was a gifted trainer of men, a teacher of the military art. Blockade. Here is a PowerPoint of the anaconda snake, the big black line of the attempt on the part of the Union Navy to starve, crush the South with blockade. With each passing month, more Union ships were added to the flotilla that had created the blockade. So with each passing month, the blockade becomes more and more effective. By March 1863, now we're jumping ahead into the middle years of the war, the Southern economy was beginning to suffer from this blockade. They were unable to sell much cotton overseas. And so the Southerners began to print money to pay their bills. And now inflation was devouring Southern wealth. The River War. The Civil War was fought primarily in two theaters, or two areas. So the word theater is a military expression meaning an area. If you go forward to the Second World War, we talk about the European theater, and we also talk about the Pacific theater, the war against Japan. Well, there were two primary theaters in the Civil War. The West, initially along the Mississippi River, and the East, again, primarily in Virginia, but it will stretch into Pennsylvania and so forth as well. Lincoln had ordered his commander in the West, Henry Halleck, and Halleck is an important figure and a man you probably not heard of. He ordered Halleck to put pressure on the South down the Mississippi River. The president correctly believed that numerous attacks at the same time would stretch Southern resources beyond capacity. Thus, attacks in both East and West were imperative. Halleck had under his command one of the few Union generals at this point of the war who was willing to fight, to be aggressive, to attack. That man was Ulysses S. Grant. I do not want you to underestimate Grant. There, for the longest time in the 20th century, Grant was thought to be lucky. He was thought to have been blessed by commanding vastly greater forces. And he was denigrated because he liked to drink once in a while. And then, of course, during the Grant administration as president, there was considerable corruption during that administration, though Grant himself was not a corrupt president. All of these things contributed to the idea that Grant was more lucky than good. The truth is exactly the opposite. It is Ulysses S. Grant who is the equal, if not the superior, of Robert E. Lee in terms of his military capabilities. It is no accident that Grant rises to command all of the Union armies by March of 1864. So setting that aside, Henry Halleck agrees to let Grant, this is Grant's idea, not Halleck's, to move south up the Tennessee River into Tennessee. The Tennessee River kind of flows to the north. And so Grant is going to use this relatively large river to move up, that is south, into Tennessee. He's going to use the Tennessee River and the Cumberland Rivers in order to accomplish this. And so in February of 1862, Grant led attacks on Confederate Forts Henry and Donelson. And he captured 12,000 Southerners at Donelson. And so now he is aggressively placing Union forces in the southern state of Tennessee. These victories, this is one of the famous photographs of U.S. Grant. And by the way, I just finished watching the History Channel documentary, 3-part documentary on Grant. If you haven't watched that, I highly recommend that you do. It is superb. These victories cheered the North. Grant is really the first hero of the North. Halleck ordered Grant to take advantage of these victories. Actually, he allows Grant to take advantage of these victories, to move south along the Tennessee to a place called Pittsburgh Landing in southern Tennessee, not far from the Mississippi border. So Grant continues to advance south. This advance is going to result in the Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh is one of the most important battles of the war. Albert Sidney Johnston was the Confederate commander at the Battle of Shiloh. And Johnston was another of the fine commanders that Jefferson Davis had at his disposal. And so Johnston now gathered all the forces in his area at Corinth, Mississippi, and then he marched them north out of Corinth towards Pittsburgh Landing and toward Grant's forces. Johnston intended to surprise Grant, and he does, in the area around a very tiny little wooden church called Shiloh. Johnston was told that Union General Don Carlos Buell would reinforce Grant perhaps within 48 hours. Johnston responded to the news, "I would fight them if they were a million. We shall attack at daylight tomorrow." As it turned out, Buell was not there yet, not there to support Grant. Johnston had ordered his regimental commanders, so a regiment at full strength is 1,000 men. Regiments by this time of the war are never at full strength. He had ordered his regimental commanders, usually a colonel, to read this message to their troops. "I will lead you to a decisive victory over agrarian mercenaries sent to subjugate and despoil you of your liberties, property, slaves, and honor. Remember the dependence of your mothers, your wives, your sisters, and your children depend on the result of this battle." Grant had so focused his mind on what he was going to do that he had not ordered his troops to dig in to prepare for a defense. He believed that Johnston's army was so demoralized that it offered little opposition. At dawn, again on April 6th, thousands of screaming rebels burst from the woods near Shiloh Church. They first hit 2 inexperienced northern divisions, again about 15,000 men now. One of them was commanded by a man who would later become a hero of the North, William Sherman. But Sherman's division is taken by surprise. Hearing the firing, Sherman stands up and his aide is shot dead at his side. And Sherman said, "My God, we're attacked." Recovering his poise, the general performed with courage and intelligence. And on the map, you can see that Sherman is on the Union right or the Confederate left. He reorganized and encouraged his troops, who held off the advancing rebels for a while. Grant, too, responded well. He wasn't even at the battlefield when news of the battle reached him. He is way upriver on the Tennessee. But he eventually gets to the battlefield during the day, and he visited each of his 5 division commanders during the day, helping to plug holes and rally troops and move units from one place to another. Plus, his mere presence on the battlefield is encouraging. But the Confederates were too much. And gradually the Yankees retreated. Some units broke and ran. Many ran all the way back to the river at Pittsburgh Landing. Grant, now in the middle of this disaster, orders General Benjamin Prentiss to hold his position in the center of the line, to hold it, and I quote, all hazards. So Prentiss and his brigade, again, about 4,500 men, they hold their position in the center of Grant's lines. This place becomes known in Union lore as the Hornet's Nest. The Southerners pounded at Prentiss's men with 62 cannon and 18,000 fanatical Confederate soldiers. Still, Prentiss held for hours and hours, buying Grant time to reorganize his forces. Prentiss holds until all that could be accomplished had been accomplished, and then he surrendered. In the midst of the day, Johnston had been shot in the leg, and he bled to death, which is not uncommon to be hit with a large mini ball, the bullet that was fired from the vast majority of both Union and Rebel rifles. The bullet is so large, it's like a 50 caliber slug, that it oftentimes leads to death, even if you're hit in the arm. Well, as we shall see, this is exactly what happens to Stonewall Jackson. Well, Johnston had been shot in the leg, bled to death, largely because he had sent his personal physician to help wounded Yankee prisoners. So Johnston is gone. And Johnston was a gifted commander. Who knows what the South might have been able to achieve in extending the war, or perhaps even winning the war, if Johnston had not been killed at Shiloh. But the Southerners had pushed Grant back to the Tennessee River. Late in the day, General Buell's Army of the Ohio did in fact arrive to reinforce Grant. Grant now, unlike probably any other Union commander at this time, intends a reversal of fortune in the morning. It is hard for me to think of a different Union commander who would not have loaded his troops on the river transports and gotten out of there, but not Grant. Indeed, some of Grant's aides thought he was absolutely crazy. He's insane. Has he been drinking again? The second day of battle began with Grant's counterattack. The rebels were surprised. They offered little resistance early in the morning. Then about mid-morning, as they were being pushed back, their backs stiffened and they were able to hold for a while, for a few hours. And for those few hours in the middle of the day, the combat raged as hotly as it had the previous day. As they advanced, the Union troops were shocked by the sight of their own dead from the previous. They're retaking the ground upon which the battle was waged the day before. And here are the dead, and here are even the wounded still clinging to life. One soldier wrote, their groans and cries were heartrending. The gory corpses lying all about us, slain by an inconceivable variety of wounds. These were shocking to behold. By mid-afternoon, the now far more numerous Union troops had pushed the Confederates back to their original lines of the previous day. About 2:30 that afternoon, Beauregard's chief of staff, and it was Beauregard, by the way, who had taken over for Johnston. Beauregard's chief of staff said to him, and I quote again, "Do you not think our troops are like a lump of sugar, thoroughly soaked in water and ready to dissolve?" I don't know why, but I've always remembered that quote over the years. Do you not think our troops are like a lump of sugar, thoroughly soaked in water and ready to dissolve? Beauregard lamentably agreed and ordered retreat. Summary. Though the North had won a victory at Shiloh, the fierceness of the fighting, which was the first truly large battle of the war, made Northerners realize that the South would not be defeated quickly or easily. And here's a fact that most Americans don't know, even many students of the Civil War, but the casualties were so shocking, both North and South, that Halleck, after the battle, relieved the victorious Grant of command. Grant is out of a job for a while, and he even thinks about resigning his commission and going home. Thank God he did not. And it was probably William Tecumseh Sherman who talked him out of doing it. Before Shiloh, Grant believed that one more Union victory would bring about the South's defeat. So Grant, before Shiloh, was on board with the idea that just one good bloody nose, or maybe 2 or 3 good defeats, and the Southerners would give up. After Shiloh, Grant was convinced that victory would necessitate a long war, a complete war of total conquest. In Grant's mind, at least, the limited war for limited means was over. Lincoln was not there yet, but the Battle of Shiloh will help him get there. The South blamed Beauregard for snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. This was not so. It was not fair. And the Southerners now realized that their hold on Mississippi was in jeopardy. Well, I thank you for your attention. Again, if you have questions about this lecture, please send me an email. And as always, I pray God's blessing upon you that you will receive faith and grace from the hands of the living God. In Jesus' name, amen.